Welcome back to the Apologist Bookshelf. I'm Gary Zacharias. We had started a podcast last time covering a chapter in J.P. Moreland's book called The God Question, and I only made it about halfway through. It's such a rich chapter. There's so much there. So if that's okay, I'd like to continue with that chapter so you can kind of get the feel for the structure that J.P. Moreland is doing here. So the previous podcast was dealing with a chapter called Why Can't I Be Happy? And he said Americans in the last, let's say, 40 years or so have had a hard time finding happiness. And what do we get? A depressed, anxiety-filled society. And he said part of the problem is the fast pace of life, that we're losing a sense of community. We've got moral relativism. Nobody knows what is true or right to do anymore. But he said we're so filled with this anxiety, we put our life into a fast mode, right? Everything's hurry. Everything's go, go, go. And he said at this point in the chapter, he said he's going to start talking about God. And he said it's hard to get into that talk about God because people don't hear it as a fresh thing. He said a lot of people will not be followers of Jesus and they'll be defensive about it. And he said, but we need to be true to ourselves. We need to think. We need to at least give JP a hearing. And he said many people that he's talked to and people that he's read about don't really want God to exist. And he asks the question, why are you an atheist? And he said some people are had a bad relationship with their own father. And then he said some people want to be liberated from morality. They don't want God to kind of pin them in. And he quoted Aldous Huxley on that. He said another problem, he said, comes to mind is the unfair picture, what would you call it, a caricature of Christians that are out there. And he said it's not true that the more education you get, the less likely you will be to be a Christian. In fact, it works the other way around. Higher proportions of evangelicals have studied at graduate school level than have people who are fundamentalists, liberals, or even the non-religious. So he said the issue, of course, is the Christian God real? Can he be known? Is Jesus really the Son of God? Is Christianity what you need? Is it something you're looking for? So he said the issue is not whether Christians are hypocrites. The issue is Jesus in your life. But he said he's also writing the book, and this is where the second half of this chapter comes in. He said he's also writing this book for Christians who have gotten pretty familiar with Christianity. And he said, maybe you're bored with church, you think it's a bunch of religious games, and you tried the Christian thing for a while, and it really wasn't what it was cracked up to be. He said the old story, been there, done that, bought the T-shirt. So it's like too much familiarity. But he said, I'm asking you to listen again to the invitation as if it was the first time. So he said, you and I have lives to live. How can we get better at living our life? And so he said, here we go. And his next chapter is getting in. So he ends this section of his book by saying, let's move on. We've got lives to live. How could we get better at it? And he said he now wants to move to what he thinks is kind of at the bottom of why we can't find much happiness in life. He said it's dealing with broad cultural ideas about life and reality and confidence. So he's on his way to the next section of his book here. And he said that he did I guess it was a debate one time with another scholar who was a UCLA professor, Jeffrey Schwartz. And I said it was interesting that Schwartz was actually pretty much in agreement with JP regarding the existence of the soul, that it was a spiritual substance different from the brain, and so therefore people have free will. So that was interesting. Schwartz found out that by exerting free will, now he did a bunch of different experiments to do this, but by exerting free will, you can actually change the physical structure of the brain. Wow. So we can alter our brain, Schwartz says, and how it facilitates anger or anxiety or whatever. And Schwartz's punchline in the debate, as he was talking with JP, people who see the glass half full, talking about their lives, end up happier and healthier and more functional than people who don't. And he said also that Christian theists, people who believe there's a God, will have a substantial leg up on people who don't have that belief. Wow. So JP says, you know what this all comes down to? You are what you think. Isn't that interesting? So he said, you will live up to or you will live down to your actual beliefs. In other words, your worldview, what you actually believe about God or reality or meaning or value or success and things like that, that's the most important factor about your life. He says that's way more important than having a flat stomach, being healthy, or fulfilling the American dream. So I just want to hit that one more time. So what you actually believe, your view of who you are and why you're here and is there a God and what's reality all about, what's the meaning of life, all those things, it's called a worldview. That's the most important factor about your life. So he said, maybe we should be seeking meaning and purpose instead of pleasure. And he said there's been other studies that have said when baby boomers, people that are my age pretty much, when they stop trying daily to live for something bigger than they are and live for themselves, oh, man, that was Depression City, right? Boomers had stopped trying to live for something bigger like God or country or their family, and they were living for themselves, get that money and have those vacations. And he said, maybe you can identify with this. He said, just take a second. Why don't you think about your neighbors, your relatives, your co-workers? What are they living for? What idea of success do they think is happening to them? He said, now ask yourself the same question. Be ruthless. And said, let's take stock of what we learned so far. So he goes back again. I told you JP is so good at summarizing where he's been in his talk and his thoughts and what's ahead. So he said, fewer and fewer people are experiencing a really sense of well-being day after day. Our pace of life is too fast. We've lost community. We're hurrying. But he says there's a deeper root cause. There's something about our belief patterns. We're people who see the glass half empty. We don't have life-enhancing, brain-restoring beliefs. We no longer try to live for something bigger than our own lives. So what are we doing? We're focusing on our energies on personal pleasure, building up that bank account, taking those trips, having that new car, buying whatever product is being advertised. He tells about a book that came out in 1979. He said it's really a powerful book. Christopher Lasch was the author, Lasch. It's called The Culture of Narcissism. He calls that one of the most insightful analysis of American culture that JP ever read. So what Lasch did, he looked at cultural patterns for the previous 21 years, so I'd take it back into the late 50s. And here's the book's subtitle, American Life in an Age of Diminished Expectations. He said, Lasch now says that the late 50s therapists began to see a whole lot more people that were coming to see them, but they didn't really have a specific problem. It's just anxiety and depression. And he said they were going from what he called inner-directed to narcissistic, thinking about yourself all the time. So he said more and more Americans were preoccupied with their own self-absorbed infantile needs. Isn't that a great way to put it? So he said, we've got a shift going on now. This is JP, back to JP. He said, the word happiness has really changed. It's changed from the time of Moses and the ancient Greeks and even up into middle of the 20th century in America. He said, now it has to do with a pleasurable feeling. Like we got a raise, our team won, I was able to buy something. So now we have happy hour. But he said, in the old days, like in the Moses time period and Greeks and so on, the classic definition of happiness was way different. It was a life that you've lived well, a life full of wisdom and virtue. And he said, you can't find that in the dictionary anymore. He said, people are just obsessively concerned with feeling happy, right? Think about Disneyland, happiest place on earth. He said, but there are a couple of problems with having this as your goal. He said, for one thing, pleasurable satisfaction is good, nothing wrong with that, but it shouldn't be the goal of life. And he said, actually, the best way to find pleasurable satisfaction is not to seek it, but to seek something else in which that satisfaction, that pleasure, is a byproduct. So he said, feelings are wonderful servants, but terrible masters. And here's the irony. When people make happiness their goal, they don't find it. So they start living their lives vicariously through maybe celebrities, trying to identify themselves with that. He says people literally need to get alive. He said they've got to find something bigger and more important to live for than just their own pleasure. And they've got to have a new strategy. So he said the ancients, one more time, happiness was a life that was lived well. And it had a sense of well-being at the bottom. So he said, we've lost that classic notion for this trivial, superficial counterpart. And it's ended up with what psychologists call the empty self. And he said, JP now is saying, all of us, our neighbors, our coworkers, we've been damaged by this shift in culture. And so the empty self can't face living in the real way. He said, think about secularism. Lash talked about that in his book. He said there was religious skepticism, a lot of cynicism and indifference regarding religions and all. And he said it's secularism, according to Lash, that's responsible for this despair and resignation that so many people have. Dallas Willard says the same thing about how bad negative secularism has been. Dallas Willard's an amazing author and thinker. Here's what Willard said. JP quotes him. The crushing weight of the secular outlook permeates or pressures every thought we have today. Sometimes it even forces those who self-identify as Christian teachers to set aside Jesus' plain statements about the reality and total relevance of the kingdom of God and replace them with philosophical speculations whose only recommendation is their consistency with a modern mindset. The powerful, though vague and unsubstantiated presumption is that something has been found out that renders a spiritual understanding of reality in the manner of Jesus simply foolish to those who are in the know. So I hope you understand what Willard was saying there. The people are setting aside what Jesus had to say about relying on God and the importance of God, and we've replaced it with all these philosophical speculations. And so back to JP, he says there's a fear that God is dead, and it's just crushed the real classic happiness among the American people. Yeah. Said it'd be like playing Monopoly, but having a game that has no purpose. So it doesn't matter what you do with your turn. Just taking a turn is pointless and empty. And he said, being sincere is not enough. We've got to know what life is all about. He says, that's where we stand today. We've got just a pattern of ideas in our culture that tell us life has no meaning. And so we have this principle that knowledge is limited to what can be tested by the five senses, and the hard sciences are really our only source of knowledge of how life really functions. So that's where we are. In other words, JP says people are telling us it's science alone that carries authority in culture. Wow. So he said science can't even formulate a central question of importance. It can't tell us if there's a God, if there's meaning to life, if there's such a thing as right or wrong, what a good person is, how do I become one, and so on. He said, so now we've got no body of ethical or religious knowledge like in universities and schools. Ethical and religious claims are just talked about as being a private affair, and they don't bring them out as important issues to talk about. So if you deny truth and knowledge and rationality outside the hard sciences, what do you have? You have people without hope that there's some kind of true form of moral and theological wisdom that could be discovered. So what's happened? If the wisdom and the rationality is tossed aside, people turn to emotions and just satisfying our desires. He said that's a shift of the worldview, tremendous worldview. He said we had a worldview. He wants to provide a brief sketch of these secularizing ideologies and how they've impacted us. So here's number one. He says we've got naturalism. That's the view that the universe of physical objects is all there is, or ever will be. So just look around, right? If you can touch it, if you can taste it, if you can put it under a microscope, that's all there is. So it says it encourages the idea of scientism, the idea that only the things we can know are things that could be tested scientifically? Yeah. So what does naturalism tell us? It's got its own creation story. So here's how it goes. You have the atomic theory of matter and evolution. So you get things changing by evolution. And he said we get a creation story that events just happen because one thing leads to another and leads to another. And physical entities are all that exist. So the mind is really just the brain. He said we're also dealing with another problem that's come along at this time, another secularizing ideology, he calls it, and that's postmodernism. Now, I would say postmodernism is kind of on its way out. JP's book is, let me get the date on this. It was written in, 2009. So I think it's beginning to wane. But the idea is postmodernism was a reaction to modernity, which was part of the Enlightenment. Now, postmodernism clashes with that, and it says it's a reinterpretation of what knowledge is. So for the postmodernist, and even though it may be weakening, it has influenced and it has changed a lot of people. But anyway, for the postmodernists, there's no such thing as objective reality. There's no such thing as objective truth or knowledge or value or reason. Those are just social constructions. That's just people doing linguistic work on you there. So they're relative not to individuals, but to social groups that share a narrative. Okay, so things like if your social group is Christianity, you've got your own story. Marxists have their own story. Atheists have their own story, and so on. So JP says, all right, if that's what's going on, what's happening here? Both naturalism and postmodernism imply something really important. There's no objective meaning or purpose to life. Wow. Yeah. He quotes from Bertrand Russell, and he says, this is what we get. Now, this is JP saying, this is what you get. Listen to Bertrand Russell if you believe that there's no objective or meaning or purpose to life. So I'm going to read it. It's, I guess, a lengthier quote, but I think this really captures what teachers are telling their students, what politicians are telling the people under them. This is really powerful. So Russell said this: that man is the product of causes which had no prevision of the end they were achieving, that his origin, his growth, his hopes and fears, his loves, and his beliefs are but the outcome of accidental collocations of atoms, that no fire, no heroism, no intensity of thought and feeling can preserve an individual life beyond the grave, that all the labors of the ages, all the devotion, all the inspiration, all the noonday brightness of human genius are destined to extinction in the vast death of the solar system, and the whole temple of man's achievement must inevitably be buried beneath the debris of a universe in ruins. All these things, if not quite beyond dispute, are yet so nearly certain that no philosophy which rejects them can hope to stand. Only within the scaffolding of these truths, only on the firm foundation of unyielding despair, can the soul's habitation henceforth be safely built. Okay, I want you to think about what was said there. So everything about us, it won't last. It'll be gone. Everything will be doomed to extinction, he says. He says it's certain. And then you're going to stand on unyielding despair to make a living, to make a life. Really? What kind of life would that be if you're basing it all on despair? So he said, this is the view of life right now. This is JP talking now. This is what people are believing in the universities, in the arts, world of the arts, in the media. Because if naturalism is true, what are you? You're just a physical object. You're just your body and your brain. And all your behavior is fixed by your environment and by the chemistry sloshing around in your brain. All your actions are determined by the laws of physics and chemistry. So you got no free will. Think about that. You have no free will. You're just reacting to things. Well, if that's the case, then you also don't have objective right and wrong. Michael Ruse, who's a naturalist, said morality is a biological adaptation no less than our hands and feet and teeth. It's just a biological adaptation. So JP says, really, there's no difference then between Mother Teresa and Adolf Hitler. And there's no real significance to anything your physical and chemically determined body does or does not do. and nothing happens for a purpose. So he said, this is the way we are in the Western world these days. So I think that is really strong stuff here. Well, he's beginning to wrap up the chapter. Let me see. All right, well, now that's pretty depressing stuff, right? He said, there is an alternate view of the world that alone will provide a context that runs completely opposite from naturalism or postmodernism. So JP says, what am I going to ask you to do? What's my recommendation? First, formulate a rational life plan for yourself, some thought-out way that you will live your life to be a rational person. Now, what would that include, he says? Well, maybe what do you value? How you spend your time? What kind of person you want to become? And he said you need 2 features in this plan to help you as you're here on earth. One, it should be reasonable. In other words, it should make sense. There should be some reason to believe that it's true. And secondly, it should provide you with a safe place to stand graciously yet firmly, he said, against the cultural patterns that are going on, all of that negative stuff in there, especially with the postmodern view and all these negative ways of saying things. He said, I don't believe such a life plan is possible unless God really exists. Okay, so that's where he's going for the rest of the book here. He said, God is a certain kind of being. We can know he's real and what he's like and what he thinks like. He said, otherwise we've got no escape. So he said, he's going to follow now at that point the rest of the book, and he's going to discuss reasons why he believes there is a solution to our dilemma. We don't have to stand in despair as, how is that phrase here from Russell? On the firm foundation of unyielding despair. Do you want to stand on that? No, I don't think so. All right, so that's kind of all introductory material to JP's main points, which he will develop in later chapters, and we'll cover them in future podcasts. Well, thank you for your time. Talk to you later.